I may have to relocate in my house, so I will be right back. September 6th, 2023, and this is a public meeting of the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, Settlement and Policy Subcommittee. Next slide. Let's start with introductions. Pastor Weisner, our co-chair for the subcommittee, can start, although, as he has said, he is a bit under the weather today. So, Pastor Weisner, do you want to introduce yourself?
I do, and I'm trying to get here. There we are. I want to thank everyone. I'm Pastor Weisner. I am the chair of the settlement policy, also full co-chair of the full committee group committee. And I'll pass it over to, looks like I see Tia immediately up here.
Okay. Hello, my name is Tia Palafox. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a member of PCCEP and the co-chair of the PCCEP Community Engagement Subcommittee since 2021. And I'll pass it to Brian.
Thank you, Tia. Byron Vaughn, PCCEP member, and also co-chair of Settlement Policy Subcommittee. Pass it to Nathan.
Thanks, Byron. Good evening, everyone. Nathan Castle, PCCEP member, he, him pronouns, and member of the subcommittee. And I think I'll pass it to Leslie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Martinez. I am a member of PCCEP. I'm also a member of this subcommittee. Yeah, happy to be here with everyone. I will pass it on to Byron.
I think Byron went. So I think that's everyone here from the PCCEP crew. Now we'll invite anyone from the city on the staff end, PPV, DOJ, anybody else who wants to provide an introduction tonight. And I'll start. I'm Dory Grabinski, PCCEP Project Manager.
My name is Bella Kerpo. I'm the Community Outreach Specialist with the Portland FBI. I've never come to a PCCEP meeting before, so I appreciate you having me, and thanks, Tia, for inviting me.
Yay, thank you.
And hi, everybody. Stephanie Howard here from the Mayor's Office.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jared Hager. I'm with the U.S. Department of Justice. Appreciate you having me. I'm going to have to leave with the first hour for another meeting. Apologies.
Hi, and this is Avi Klepper. I'm PCCEP staff. Good to be here.
All right, and I see Ashley just joined, another PCCEP member here with us. Ashley, if you want to say hi. Or we can give her a minute. Okay, let's get back to
sorry. Hi.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, hi, Ashley Schofield, she, her pronouns, PCCEP member, also subcommittee chair, co-chair for the community engagement subcommittee. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Okay, and Ashley, you want to go ahead and read our community agreements?
Sure. Yep. So listen actively and respectfully, share airtime, be present and open to new information and perspectives, assume a positive intent, respect each other, respect the group, speak your own truth, communicate directly, honestly, and respectfully, ask questions to clarify, call out bias, and be okay with ambiguity.
Excellent. All right. Now let's take a look at what we have for today's meeting. So we'll have just a couple updates to start. We're going to spend the first half of the meeting walking through a PowerPoint that gives an overview of what the PPV stops data is and how that data is analyzed. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a second. And then our co-chair, Pastor Weisner, has invited a few guests to speak a little more about the history of how that data, that collection process came to be. We have a couple of people joining us for that portion of the meeting, and then we'll have an open public comment period as usual. Yeah, so let's jump into updates. So this is the big one. We will be appointing 5 new members later this month. The exact date is still to be determined, but we will be updating PCCEP members and posting that on our channels as soon as we have it confirmed. To accompany, those appointments, we will be having an orientation and training day that all of our continuing members will also be invited to participate in. And we'll have opportunities for you all to meet those new members as well. The other update here is that, as the members of this subcommittee are aware, Anne Campbell, former co-chair of this subcommittee, ended her term of service. She was with PCCEP for quite some time, so she finished up her service with us at the end of August. So this subcommittee does need a second co-chair. I think it's up to you all to decide if you want to elect an interim co-chair or you want to wait until November when you'll be re-electing 2 new co-chairs, or just having re-elections in general, whether they're new or not. That's a discussion we could have now, or you could sort out later in terms of how you want to approach that.
Since we're so close, this is Pastor Weisner. we're only what, 2 months out, and how many more meetings?
It would be just one more meeting, like it would be the October meeting, yeah.
Yeah, and I think my vote will say go to the November election. It keeps things smooth and fluent. That's my.
Any other thoughts from the subcommittee members on this?
Yeah, this is Ashley. I agree. I think we can wait, and I think if Pastor Weisner feels like they can run the ship while we get there, I think, yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you, Ashley. I'll drive.
Okay, cool. Sounds like Tia also agrees. Sounds like we have a consensus from, or not consensus, but majority at the very least, from people who've spoken up. So I think we can hold out another month for sure. That sounds like a plan. Okay. Next slide, please. All right. And I should say, so as we've acknowledged, we have currently just one co-chair for this subcommittee. Normally we would have two. And Pastor Weisner is I think feeling a bit sick tonight, but he wanted to still go ahead with the meeting. So he has asked me to step in on this portion. Pastor Weisner, is there anything you wanted to say?
Yes, Dory, and I want to thank everyone for being here. In the thought of where the frame of this first conversation about stops data, historically, as we're going to have, hopefully, Dr. Leroy Haynes come in and speak, as well as Dan Handelman, who's coming. Those two and myself had a lot of the beginnings of all of the different challenges of informations. I wouldn't even call it challenges, but I would just say a lot of history background of a lot of where the stops were there. So I'm trying to calculate my thoughts through this sickness. So if I speak slower, please forgive me. Again, with the ideal of where we are, PCCEP is what I've always feel with this type of information, and opening this conversation will give people a clear background understanding of these reports and how we got here, as well as what has in the past, where it took the work with the people who have really come together to try to make sure that there was information to make sure that the data that's collected and the information that's being received is open and transparent for everyone. I'm trying to say it articulately, but I'm not doing a good job just listening to myself talk. But I do want to say that as what we are as a group and what we present with this information is so that there is more awareness and understanding of how this information comes and how it's gathered, and then also how that we can look at it to improve or make recommendations to improve that. There is many, like I said, from the long as I can remember, a lot of people who gather the details and information and have taken certain points of what that looks like to frame it in areas of what information was needing to be done. But again, thankful to where we are today with PCCEP and the settlement agreement, and then also the information that we're able to grab from this here is to be able to get the information so that we can always make better recommendations on the information that we're receiving for those who have been stopped. So I'm a park right there because I'm not doing a very good job and I'm talking so much and I'm out hearing myself. But the goal again is we have done so well with getting information with these type of meetings, and hopefully this will begin a great dialogue for community as well as those who have never understood the report itself, but then also a better way to be able to take and shape what we're trying to do with this start tonight. Thank you, Dory. And I appreciate everyone's bearing with me, and thank Dory for helping me through this, because
Yeah, absolutely.
I might be off the camera because I might be doing some bathroom quick breaks here and there. So I'm here listening.
Great. Yeah, we really appreciate you being here and yeah, bearing with this, even though you're not feeling so great. So thank you again, Pastor Weisner. So a couple notes on this before we get started. So I think most or all of our PCCEP members currently here were with us last year around this time when we had a meeting on the STOPS data with PPB. So this is one of the things that PCCEP is required to do by the settlement agreement, is review the STOPS data annually. So some feedback we got after that meeting last year was that PCCEP members, so the STOPS data annual report, it's a pretty dense report. It's a lot of, technical data analysis. There's a lot in there. I think it's 74 pages long. And the way we approached this last year was the PPB data team presented it to PCCEP in a meeting. The feedback that staff received about that was that PCCEP members and the community found it challenging to engage with this technical, dense information in that format, and that it was kind of intimidating in various ways. And so this time around, we're trying to approach it a little bit differently. We're planning on spending a series of meetings on the STOPS data. And I think the idea of this meeting is that it's sort of a preliminary discussion to gain an understanding of first of all, what is this report? What is it collecting? What do police officers do when they perform a stop? Like, what data are they, collecting when that happens? What are some basic steps they take when they analyze it? And what is some of the history behind those decisions? And so having those discussions internally first, so we can formulate, so PCCEP can formulate some questions before engaging with the Bureau, and then having that be a more meaningful experience for you. So although we wouldn't normally do this, we are going to spend some time looking through a publicly available PPB PowerPoint. Typically, PCCEP staff would not be presenting that, but given kind of the background I just explained, that's what we're going to be looking at in a second, is a PowerPoint created by PPB. I am not an expert on this stuff at all, but the idea, I think, again, is this is an opportunity for you to look at this PowerPoint, formulate any questions you have, and although I may not have answers to them, they're questions we can take later on when you do engage with the Bureau on the STOPS data. Does that make sense?
Perfectly well said, Dory. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dory. I think we've had conversations about this, and I'm really excited to sort of start this process. So thank you.
Okay, yeah, definitely a preliminary discussion. I'm sure will be questions I will not have answers to. So I'm gonna pull up the PowerPoint now. And again, for anyone interested, this is available on PPB's website. It's publicly available. It's the same place, I think someone may have put it in the chat. Same place where all of their annual and quarterly reports for STOPS data are. So this is the, one second here, I'm getting to view mode.
I'm going to say that as I studied this, and I think I see Dr. Haynes who came, even when I tried to begin the study of all this, it took me so many places at the beginning of trying to understand this. And if I had not had a lot of this in the history, I would have been just as lost in it. So again, I think this is a very good place to start with, even just the language itself.
Yeah. So let's jump into that. So the first slides here are just citations, more or less. So throughout, I think the text in green are when they're citing Oregon state law. And then in this teal color, it's PPV directives and procedures, etc. Okay, so what is a stop? A stop is a temporary restraint of a person's liberty by a peace officer present in any place. A person's liberty is restrained by either physical force or show of authority. During a stop, the subject is not free to leave until the officer resolves the interaction.
May I say something here, Dory?
Sure.
And for me, where I was thinking to the group is I had to understand the first slide of what it was to define what the stop is under the law, which helps me to understand where the statute, and looking at the statute number itself helped me to understand where to find the statute spy of what is given for the peace officer to make at any place. And I believe it's under, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm not sure if someone here, maybe Jared or someone else there, the Title 14 that breaks it down to 131, which defines, again, I believe, procedures of the state. But then the latter part deals with the case study of what that is to be restrained. I do know here in that study of State versus Blaine and Vane that Bishop A.A. Wells had a opportunity to testify in the Ninth Circuit about African American who was stopped by the Portland police, and then where that they had detained him. And in that area of information, he, in the state of mind that he was in, felt that he had to, he couldn't just leave. And there, that's what the statute was referring to in that area there. There's some background. Again, I'm so all over the place with this, but again, our history will come again with Dr. Haynes and others.
Yeah, I think that will be really informative. I'm going to give a suggestion. There are quite a few slides. And if people are interested in going through most of them, my suggestion is we save the history piece for the second half. And we try to get through the information here and collect any questions that come up. And maybe a PCCEP member can try to track those as they come up.
Yeah.
My suggestion. So when can a stop occur? When the officer has reasonable suspicion that a crime or violation has been committed. Was someone chiming in there? Okay, or when they suspect the subject is about to commit a crime. These things are not considered a stop. Okay, moving on. This is a little bit about when data collection is required. I think the takeaway from this slide is that PPB collects more data because of internal PPB policy, whereas state law requires like a lower burden of data collection. That is my understanding of what that is saying. Okay. So this I expect may come up from some of our guests for the second portion of this meeting. But this surprised me a little bit. I didn't know that stops data has only been being collected for the past 20 years or so. And I think we'll hear a little bit more later on about some of the community leadership and the Blue Ribbon Panel for racial profiling that impacted the creation of this process. All right, moving on. So this is a little bit about how the data collection itself works. I think it's sort of just like how PPB officers are reminded to enter the data that they collect into the system, and how that differs from how state police do that, or other law enforcement agencies. Again, I think the emphasis being there's more data collected, or a higher, more guidelines or requirements around data collection for PPB. All right, this is getting into what data specifically PPB officers collect when they make a stop. So, date and time, location, the individual that they stop, whether it's a driver or pedestrian, whether that person is on a bicycle or is a passenger. Perceived comes up a lot here. That we see that in the report as well. It's broken down by perceived age, sex, race, ethnicity. Okay, reasons for stops. So traffic is in one bucket, and then we have other crimes in another bucket. They also have to record whether or not they requested a consent search and whether they completed one. This is more information about other searches. The Portland Police Bureau has continuously collected data on discretionary searches not involving consent. And let me know if anyone wants to pause on any of these slides.
It hasn't come up yet, so maybe I should just let you go ahead. But something that I wanted to ask about was the the use of crime victimization benchmark within
that's covered later on. Yep. I think we're almost there actually. This is still in the, I think, mask that they use, so the things that they have to record about the stop. So these are all things they can indicate when they're collecting that data. A lot of stuff about warrants here.
Lori, could I just jump in really quick, if it's helpful? All of these, just so people know, all of these exceptions are created by law, so they're not just exceptions that PPB decides are exceptions. So just so you know, those categories are defined by either statute or by case law.
So Stephanie, does exception mean, like, can you speak a little more about that?
Yeah, so typically under the Fourth Amendment, officers cannot conduct a search or a seizure without probable cause. And these warrant exceptions are the times or the circumstances where an officer is allowed to conduct a search without a warrant. So when we have probable cause of something, that means, or when you get a warrant, let me say it this way. When a warrant is obtained, that means that an officer or a detective has written up an affidavit with a prosecutor. They've submitted it to a judge, and a judge has signed an order saying, yes, here is the permission for an officer to search for these things very specifically spelled out in the warrant. For these exceptions, that's they are legal categories when certain circumstances are present that would make it generally impractical or unreasonable for an officer to have to go through that process of getting a warrant. And I'm really generalizing. So for example, if you see, incident to arrest. So when an officer has developed probable cause that someone can be arrested, they are entitled to search that person as they're being arrested because they're taking custody of that person and all of their belongings to a jail. And so there's an exception that allows them to conduct a search there without a warrant. So there's just all of these specific examples where the law has provided an exception to having to get a warrant.
Gotcha. And this is all under the bucket of consent searches, right? Or so
Nope.
consent searches and then other searches.
Correct.
Okay,
A consent search would mean that would be all an officer needs to do a search of a person or their property. If that person gives consent, then an officer can search. These are all of the other circumstances when they do not have consent.
Gotcha. Okay.
And this law is it city ordinance or state law?
It's typically federal and state law.
Okay.
Constitutional, both federal constitution and state constitutional law that gets developed over decades.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah.
And Stephanie and Jared maybe can help me as well if I make a statement here, if I'm wrong, all the way off. And I'm again trying to keep myself in the area where that we move for time's sake. And the other searches are areas of where that if an officer did the actual had a go to a home for whatever reason, indicating a stop or a traffic or information that they have. I'm sorry, this is gonna get confusing. Never mind, I'm apart because this takes me to all of this other stuff that I'm trying to say, but I'm not getting it out like I want. So
well, and let me say, this is like some of the most complicated areas of law. So you are not, no one here is alone if they're like, what the heck is that all about? There's a lot of law and statute and analysis that goes into the development of all of these laws. So
you're great, Stephanie, because again, I think walking through the history of all of this with myself in time, thank God for those who have given us understanding of these things, especially at the beginning. You're right. If you don't follow the law, the statute, understanding this, but I do say that it is very interesting to be able to understand the term and the language when the officer is actually doing the work, such as example, warrant exceptions.
So, and this is part of the stops data, Stephanie, because it's just a part of everything they record, right? Like they have to, because these slides, I think we're all on the same page. Like it's nice to have this space to sort of look at this and say, raise the questions and say, actually, I don't understand that. So, and I'm right there with everyone. So the consent searches, I think all of these slides are about what is recorded. The consent searches are definitely a part of that. And the other searches are also a part of that. And that's why it's included. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think they're, because they're reporting out on consent searches, I think this is I'm not 100% sure, but my impression is that this is a report where it feels natural for them to include that information because oftentimes searches happen when there is a stop. So that is my guess. I think when the actual the data folks come and present, I think it would be great to have them clarify.
Okay, yeah, maybe that's something to mark down there. Alrighty, so then I think this is another component of, again, I think we're kind of looking at their sort of the data that they are collecting, and then sort of their reporting screen, sort of. So search findings. Here's a list of what they could find. Stop disposition. Any questions on this screen? So this seems to be, you know, outcomes as far as the outcome of the stop is how I'm understanding disposition. Kind of a piece of jargon there.
I do believe you're right, Dory, where that as they're entering in their information, in order to move on, this definitely has to be area screen information that has to be so that they have the tracking data.
Definitely. Okay. Whoops. And then we are very familiar with this. So this question was added as a part of the settlement agreement. So they collect information about whether there was a perceived mental health issue of the subject who was stopped. And I think that covers all of the information they collect during a stop. Any questions before we move on to the next section?
It's coming, Ashley.
Yes. All right, so getting a little bit into the data analysis, and again, I think really good opportunity for PCCEP to kind of look at, you know, this information from PPB and together start to think about the questions that you have and you know, formulate those. So it's an overview. So as we know, they produce both quarterly and annual reports for the stop data. That includes traffic and pedestrian stops. The quarterly report is shorter. It's every 3 months. And it doesn't include those longer term sort of statistical trends or searches or disposition, which we understand to be outcomes of those stops. State annual analysis. I just learned about this, the veil of darkness. I think Nathan was just talking about this. If other PCCEP members aren't familiar, Nathan, would you mind sharing a little bit about what you were saying? Wait, is Nathan here?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's just you know, as it says in the slide, it's comparing, you know, the stops outcomes and disparities between daylight and nighttime hours, and specifically, you know, I think they control for like time of day and you know, different sunset times and whatnot. But the idea being that when it's dark out, you can't necessarily see someone's race as easily, and so that sort of controls for some of the bias. And if your racial bias is substantially different between darkness versus daylight hours, that sort of implies that officers are engaging in racially discriminating behavior.
Great. Sorry, I didn't mean to change the slide there. Thanks, Nathan. Okay, and then here's the PPV annual report. So this is what we have looked at as a group before, and we'll look at again this year. PCCEP is required again to review this every year. Identifies disparate outcomes and results for subjects based on perceived race, ethnicity, sex, age group, and mental health status. So I think now we get into the benchmarking discussion. Oh, that keeps happening. Okay. A different benchmark is used for different operational divisions of the PP. Wait, is this the right slide? Yes, sorry. A different benchmark is used for the different operational divisions of the PPV due to a difference in the mission, tactics, and reason for stop. The traffic division is primarily concerned with curbing dangerous driving behaviors that frequently contribute to collisions and fatalities on Portland roadways. Non-traffic division includes all personnel from patrol and investigative divisions. Primarily utilizes traffic stops as a way to contact potential subjects of interest and investigate criminal activity. Secondary mission is to promote road safety. Okay, so I think that's relatively clear. It's saying they choose different statistical benchmarks because they have different goals for these divisions. And now I think they're getting into which benchmarks they choose given those different goals. For traffic, the injury collision benchmark is used to estimate the racial and ethnic demographics of drivers in Portland, identified as a best practice benchmark in research literature. Unbiased indicator since injury collisions usually require a police response. Can also be a general indicator of driving quantity and behavior. Okay. Shall I go on? Okay. Non-traffic benchmark. The violent crime victimization benchmark is used to estimate the racial ethnic demographics of individuals that may come into contact with patrol and investigative officers in the Portland Police Bureau. PPB officers primarily concerned with reducing and investigating violent crime are more likely to spend time in neighborhoods that experience crime. Benchmark acts as a proxy by assuming that the victim demographics of violent crime are reasonable estimates of the communities they live, play, and work. Okay. Any questions? Things we want to touch on here? I think this was the thing Ashley had a question about.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Dan Handelman asked the question I kind of was thinking about too, of like, you just, when you read this, if it doesn't make any, it's hard to understand why this is like the reasonable reason to use that sort of benchmark, you know, because that's the whole argument that, well, there's more police in the area, then more crime will be seen. But, you know, that's, I mean, clearly there's just some like conflict there. And I think this is the part where people are like, and I think I remember this conversation last year of just how does that seem like a reasonable data collection? And so, yeah, I think maybe answering Dan's question, it just makes more sense of like, you know, what does being a victim of crime have to do with police pulling people over? I don't know. Just like, I live in Southwest Portland. I never see police around here, but that doesn't mean there's not crime around here and there's not something that could be caught if there were people here. And so like being a victim of crime and going there and being in that community, I don't know. I think I'm talking with my bias hat on, so I'll just stop.
Well, but you're flagging, it's a question, definitely a question to write down along with a few others that have been identified. I do think that also came up last year. Nathan?
Yeah, I do just want to point out it's violent crime. And I think the idea behind that is that, you know, where some of the other like property crimes and whatnot are maybe not going to be as reported as consistently in certain neighborhoods, things like violent crime, I think, you know, the idea at least is that people are more likely to, you know, follow up and report on that. Obviously things like homicides and whatnot, like if there's a body, there's, you know, the police are going to respond to that. So that's going to be really consistent. But, you know, I think, you know, people in the Southwest Hills, and I could be wrong about this, but my guess is that if they're the victim of a serious violent crime, they're going to be about as likely to call police for that as someone anywhere else in the city. And that's, you know, maybe not just going to be as subject to bias as something like, you know, reporting car break-ins or whatnot.
Okay, so, but yeah, I think, again, the purpose being collecting some questions here, so, definitely will note that. And again, I think, yeah, benchmarking, I would say two questions that seem to have come up both last year and I'm seeing in the chat and what's being discussed. The thing that is used for benchmarking and also like just the practice of benchmarking in general, like what exactly that is a good question for the data team and why it's used. And I think there's more detail about this in the report itself, but benchmarking, I believe, is the practice of using a different set of data or a different set of percentages or statistics compared to the census data for an area. So as a practice, I think that's a question that has come up a few times as well. Okay, so we'll note those. Oh, okay, actually, here it is. Okay. I think we have a question from community. We can take that, Meg.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. It seems like benchmarking, like itself as a term, is causing confusion, but it's like it's a useful statistical tool because if you're trying to determine whether or not there is bias in a certain neighborhood, for instance, it's useful to know the demographics of that neighborhood. So you know, like if you pulled over but like many people of color in Portland specifically, that would be a red flag to a different extent than in St. Louis, for example, because there are more people of color in St. Louis. So you have to use benchmarking to determine the general demographics of like where you're at. So you know what to compare your data to. I don't know if that makes any sense or is clarifying for anybody.
Yeah, that definitely is, and it makes sense. I think it's just like for me, it's like it feels like a question of like, where does the bias sort of stay within that, like in those parameters? So yeah, that totally makes sense, especially with a city like Portland that has a very large, you know, certain race, and so yeah, and having those benchmarks helps us like kind of even the field a little bit.
Yeah, Meg, thanks for that. I think the question is, for example, on this slide, the question I'm hearing is why is the census data not, and this slide does provide the perspective from the Bureau, because for example, in the example you provided, the demographics are so different from place to place, or can vary so much. And there are choices made about how things are benchmarked. And I think that's the question at play, not that it's not a useful statistical tool.
I think that like just from what I've heard PPP say, like census demographics are really a lot broader than what you want to use for stops data. And when you can get really, really local, especially when they're small pockets, small communities that tend to be really hyper localized, victimization of crime, so the demographics of who is victimized, it is a good benchmarking tool because it's already generally less biased, because if you're calling the police because you have been the victim of a crime, the police aren't biased in coming and responding to you. Like they're not making an active choice. You're saying that you were the victim of a crime. So that can be really useful for determining what kinds of, like, what community you're in. Because if there are lots of victims of crime that are not biased crime specifically in a certain area, you can say that that community tends to have different demographics than other parts of the city.
Yeah, thank you for that. So here we have an explanation of why the Bureau does not use census demographics. They say it's not a reliable estimate of who may be using the roads as drivers, doesn't include non-residents who might be in Portland, does not account for variation in demographics in different parts of Portland, and suspect demographics, bias measured due to systemic racism in the criminal justice system, so that's why they don't use suspect demographics. 911 callers not comprehensively tracked and prone to bias, as different communities are more likely to call 911 than others. All right. The overall stop rate for each demographic group is the benchmark for searches conducted by PPB officers. Okay. Any questions here? All right.
I have a question, but I'm gonna pose my question, hold my question.
Okay.
It really, yeah.
All right. I mean, you can feel free.
It's just some of the things I think may come out with when Dan and Pastor Haynes may have, because I'm very unclear on my thinking right now, because I think about other things that's overlapping into benchmarking when I think of this question.
Just hold on to that thought. Barb?
Thank you. I'm just trying to follow my own logic, and maybe it just is outside of logic. And it seems to me like if it just said that different communities are prone to calling 911 differentially, which is why they don't use the 911 demographics. Then isn't that almost the same as saying different communities are willing to report crimes differently? And then doesn't that get into the bias then in exactly what they're using as the benchmark?
I think that's a great question, Barb. I think whoever of our PCCEP members is tracking the questions, that's a really good thing to add to this discussion. I'm following your logic there, and
Thanks. I couldn't write it, so.
Yeah, I think that's a great question to kind of add to what was previously discussed.
So then, Dory, on that other slide that you had there, is in the collecting of the data, the data itself, what gets thrown out in the report that looks like it's the same person in the area, it's that many stops that has been done with that person? Does it still track that much data?
Like if the same person gets stopped a bunch of times?
Yeah, yes. I think of how many times that, which is the question I have, but it's not going to come out as I think that it will come out later in some of the
Yeah, we can record that question. I think we may have people here who can answer it. As far as I know, every individual stop is recorded, as far as I'm aware.
Thanks, Joy.
Yeah. All right. This is getting into the analysis. So this is saying that the data acquired by this process can only be used for statistical purposes. They can't reveal the identity of people stopped through these types of reports, or the identity of any law enforcement officers. So these reports, yeah, they're purely for statistical analysis, is essentially what I gather from this. This is where you can find these reports. So a couple of changes that have been made to or how changes can be made to the reporting process, collection process. And again, this is pretty technical, but just how they change the process and in terms of adding something to, additional data they might want to collect, or something like that. And it looks like it goes through quite a bit of vetting here in their system. And I think that is it. Anything we want to revisit here? Anything else we wanted to go back and look at more deeply, or any questions we want to address right now? Or probably not address, but yeah, anything we want to revisit?
I'm clear.
Yeah, I'm clear too. I mean, I think data still makes the eyes gloss over, but that was really helpful. And I think, yeah, I think just, having this primer, I think will help our conversation when, when PBB comes and does the data stop presentation. And I was just curious though, like, do they know that we're doing this at PCCEP? Because, they're coming, they know they come here, but do they know that we're looking to kind of drill in a little bit more of, like, maybe not the methodology, but like, yeah, these questions with bias could lay around, and like, maybe not that specific question, but like, we're trying to delayer it a little bit, so demystify it in a sense, I guess. And are they aware that that's our goal here?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, they are aware. And I think, yeah, the next step in this process is sort of figuring out when you all would like to engage with their data team, what questions you want to bring forward, and look into. Oh yes, and I should say, absolutely, if there are questions from community that arose for you from the process of looking at this presentation, you can either share them with us verbally in this meeting, or put them in the chat, or send them to our PCCEP inbox for our PCCEP members to consider as they move forward with this work. So if anyone wants to speak on that now, you are welcome to, but you can also send them to us in a written form. Oh, Byron, go ahead.
I had a quick, I guess, me looking on the outside in, the data that they collect, how is the data that they collect? How is it that we still have the same problems with the data? Because it seems like, I don't know, to me, they get comfortable with the data, and I believe I spoke about this before, but with the data, they feel like their job is being met, or there's things that are being achieved with the data, when there's actually, if you look at the data and you look to real life or people on the streets, that the data don't match. I'm not sure if that's a question I'm asking or just a statement that I'm making, but I don't know if data gives us false hope or give us false feelings that our job is being done by looking at data that doesn't necessarily tell us the whole story.
Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying, Byron.
Well stated too, Byron.
Tia, go ahead.
I don't know if I have it completely formulated, but I would like to know more about how they do work with 911 or BOIC as far as any bias or stereotypes that they have in passing from the call to the police. Just that connection there.
That might, Stephanie, do you have any insight on that question?
I think if I understand, Tia, you're curious about how like 911 dispatchers are trained to avoid bias in how they dispatch police officers. Is that sort of along the lines of what you're asking?
Yes, just
Great.
I'm trying to formulate that question.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think there's a ton of training that goes into being a dispatcher, and I will look right now to see what information I can pull about that. But I think there's, the director of BOEC and the team over there they have dedicated equity staff. They're very, very equity focused. So let me see what I can find in terms of policies or examples to share. So I'll circle back to you on that and shortly.
But it's interesting that it says that they don't keep track of data. What they don't 911 doesn't. I didn't quite catch that.
Doesn't use, I think.
Well, I think what that was saying is that 911 doesn't collect demographics data. And that makes sense if you think about it, because a 911 operator is only connecting with someone on the phone, generally in a moment of crisis, right? And so in order for them to collect that kind of data, we would be asking 911 operators to ask people for their race during those kind of conversations. That's just the first thought that kind of comes to mind. I'm sure there's much more complicated reasons around why they don't collect that, but let me look into it. I think it is an interesting question.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Yeah, so I think we are just about on schedule here to take our 5-minute break. And then when we get back, we'll be joined by some of our invited guests who are going to speak a little bit more about the history and some other discussion around the stops data that can inform PCCEP's work moving forward. So let's meet back here at about 7:07 or so. So we'll see everybody then.
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
Okay, so we can get slides again, please. And just so it doesn't get lost, and don't forget at the end of the meeting, PCCEP members, I wanted to let you know, within the Community Safety Division where PCCEP is housed, as you know, we have data analysts, and a couple of them I've spoken with are willing to meet with PCCEP members if you are interested, or as a group, to kind of talk through any questions that you might have when you're looking at the report itself, and help you kind of understand like what the trends are saying, what the data itself says. I think you know, in this meeting we have not actually looked at what the data for this year is saying, right? And so if you want some additional support in kind of understanding the report itself and formulating some questions moving forward, and I think, you know, the next meeting we have on this, we likely will be meeting with the PPB data team to ask your questions and share anything that you'd like. So I just wanted to give that update as well. Okay, so now we're jumping into the second portion of our meeting, and we're talking a little bit more about the history and some additional context around the STOPS data. Can get the next slide, please. So our co-chair, Pastor Weisner, has invited some guests tonight, and I will hand it over to him to introduce our guests, and we'll go from there.
Thanks again, Dory. And I was trying to write down my comments so that I can kind of stay close to my contents of being understood as best I can during this difficult time for me to think through this sickness that I'm in. But I wanted to start off and say again, this is a great discussion tonight that helps open up the awareness. And I think we're, as a group, are doing great in being able to get our questions together so that we'll be more informed and understanding of how this works, which brings me to the place of our guests that I thought of that would probably help to bring their experience from the areas of what during the times that Portland had started, the Portland Police Bureau has started and has stopped gathering information, and what that information has done and why it was so important to move and continue to keep the information before us. We have, of course, as everyone knows, one of my, great friends and brother in the gospel, as well as mentor, who I've worked very strong with during a lot of the beginning of the, I believe, second round, as Dan probably reminded me, and possibly the first round of data collecting, Dr. Leroy Haynes, with the Albino Ministerial Alliance and Coalition. Please forgive me again. We also have Vadim, who I have recently have had a great honor of sitting down and talking with him, even as he is now venturing into some of the work together that we'll be working in the NAACP, but also has a great source of information of how and what he has experienced with the data information that he has worked with. And then, of course, we have the undisputable champ, Mr. Dan Handelman. And Dan, I use that lightly, but everyone knows that Dan has been definitely at every and documented as much history of helping our community, Albino Ministerial Alliance, as well, with a lot of information and keeping track of all of that. With that being said, I would like to start with Dan Handelman and then have Dr. Leroy Haynes, and then also Badine, not in the order of just a speaking, but as a team to talk collectively, where that they will be able to speak again on this important discussion and awareness that I think that we are really working and trying to keep what has done in the past, the important information that the work has started, so that this great group can continue moving the ball and understanding it forward. So at this point, Dan, would you like to start this off for me, please?
Sure, Pastor Wisner. It's great to have been invited to present to the PCCEP after being an audience member for many, many years. And I appreciate all your work and the fact that you're digging into these numbers now. And I understand you haven't looked at this year's numbers, but I'm probably going to mention them as part of what I'm saying right now. So the city of Portland started, and you may have heard this, I didn't hear the first half hour of your meeting because there was another meeting, but the city of Portland started collecting stop data in the year 2000 at the behest of Chief Mark Croker. He set up a blue ribbon panel. There's a lot of, let's say, back and forth over the many years between the police bureau and the community about whether an indication that there is a disproportionate number of Black people being stopped, it means that individual police officers are racist or not. And I think that part of that is a lot of defensiveness and that not recognizing that we're in a society that is just steeped in racism, that is based and founded on racism, that was based on, you know, the institution of slavery and other racist practices. So it's not necessarily the individual officers themselves or their fault that we live in a racist society, but it's a reflection of that racist society. So there was a lot of that kind of this, you know, defensiveness going on from the police when this first data came out. Commissioner Joanne Hardesty used to be the executive director of a group called Oregon Action, and in 2006, they started doing community listening sessions about racial profiling, put together a very comprehensive report about what they heard in the community. And then I think Dr. Haynes is going to talk more about this next part. In between 2007 and 2008, there was a city-run committee on racial profiling that Dr. Haynes and I sat on, and Commissioner Hardesty, who wasn't the commissioner yet then, but I like to use her term of honor. So then that resulted in a plan that the PPB put out about how they were going to address racial profiling. That came out in 2009. And then there's a group that preceded you that was called the Community Police Relations Committee, or CPRC, that was, and notice they didn't say CPRC, by the way, for the people who like to say PCCEP. It was called the CPRC. Anyway, they were tasked with looking at their stop data, and they would do that at the meetings. And the police sat at the table with the community members, and there was a lot of that same kind of defensiveness, but it was still a productive dialogue. And then because that was they were part of the Human Rights Commission, and in the original draft of the settlement agreement, the CPRC was going to turn into what became the Community Oversight Advisory Board, which eventually became the PCCEP. There was an assumption that they would stop doing the stops data because they thought the COAB was going to do it. And the COAB never really did. So community members were looking at the stop data for a while between 2015 and, or it was between, well, I think 2008 and 2015, but then it kind of stopped as the COAB, the Community Oversight Advisory Board, existed and then stopped existing. And as you heard already, the Bureau started putting out these annual reports with a lot more deep dive in them, trying to figure out what these numbers mean and trying to do these benchmarks. And they started breaking out in 2014, I think, the gang enforcement team, which had a bit much higher, like 50, 60, 70% of their stops were of Black people. In the city, it's 6% Black. And there was no real explanation for that, except there were some of this talk about crime victimization, which is something that I and our organization find very problematic. And I'll get back to that in a second. But then there's the gang enforcement team became the gang violence reduction team. They also had biased data. where the numbers were closer to 50%, but it was still higher than the 6% to 20% is about roughly the number of stops, the percentage of stops of Black drivers in Portland hovers at over the years. And these other these specialty units had 50, 60, 70%. And so then in 2022, they released their 2021 report that showed, and one of the most important questions is what happens after this person is stopped. As Mr. Castle brought up the question of, can you even see what race the person is under the veil of darkness, and which is another problematic term, but yeah, that's fine. But once you stop the car and they roll down the window, then how do you behave toward the people? And for many years, there was not only a disproportionate percentage of searches for Black drivers, but the percentage of contraband was much lower, meaning that they were being oversearched, right? That the police were saying, I think this person has something to hide, and searching Black people more often. And that showed up, that kind of bias showed up in the 2021 numbers still. Those numbers are getting better in terms of over searching and not finding as much contraband. And I will give the Police Bureau credit for that. We're not exactly sure why that is, but it's there's some consciousness of that. This year, in the 2022 report, the Focused Intervention Team, which is the latest iteration of what was the Gang Enforcement Team, the Gun Violence Reduction Team, it showed that 44% of their stops were of Black people in a city, again, that's 6% Black. And we've had these discussions also, and Mr. Castle can confirm this, at the Training Advisory Council, where they hear the data on police use of force, which are very similar. In fact, in many ways worse than the traffic stop data, that Black people in Portland have been the recipients of 20 to 30% of the uses of force over the years, and roughly that much of deadly force as well, versus about 20% of the stops. And the assertion that you've heard a little bit in that slide presentation, and that the Police Bureau has said repeatedly since several years ago, is that there are all sorts of people driving into Portland and upsetting the demographic makeup of our city, which is why you have such a large number of people, of Black people, receiving force and being stopped. But in order for a city that has 6% of Black people to have 20% of them be subjected to force, or 20% of them subjected to traffic stops, in a city that's got about 650,000 people in it, 89,000 people who aren't Black would have to leave the city every day, and 89,000 people who are Black would have to drive in, which is more than the entire Black population of the rest of the state of Oregon. So when the police inevitably come up with this argument that they're going to say people drive in, I want you to keep those numbers in mind. And so that's, I'm going to just stop there and turn it over to my, calling Dr. Haynes a mentor is an understatement for what Pastor Weisner said. He's just so wise, and he has so much history, and he has done so many things for our community and for civil rights for decades. So I guess I'll turn it back over to him. Thank you.
I want to thank the committee for the invitation, and it's always a good thing to go behind Dan and his data analysis. He has a gift and graces for that. I'd like to kind of begin talking about the legacy. I want to first say that I serve on the Urbana Ministry Alliance Coalition for Justice when Mayor Potter started the Racial Profiling Commission. As Brother Dan has said previously, Chief Kruger, coming from Los Angeles, had begun the process of collecting the data. On that question, one of the big questions we had on that commission, and also we were, AMA was a part of the state. There was a state commission that began to collect data. Previously, there was no data that was collected statewide. And so we had also representatives on the state racial profiling commission in the state of Oregon. But getting to the city, under the first city, under Mayor Potter, Chief Sizer was at the time Chief Police. Robert King was president of the Union Police. Darrell Turner was vice president of the union at that time. And our discussion conflict on the data in terms of what is racial profiling, what is racial profiling, and it took several months to begin to even zoom in on that definition that we eventually begin to look at the Justice Department definition of racial profiling, as well as we try to do the data that came in on racial bias. And I want to say that there's so much data out there on racial bias, as well as racial profiling, not limited to what is collected from our Portland Police Bureau. But I think one of the things that would be helpful to the committee to look in terms historically in the legacy of racial profiling and racial bias. Race-based decisions making has been part of America since the Fugitive Slave Act and the pre-Civil War period. A pair of acts that took place in 1793 and 1850 that authorized the capture and the re-enslavement of runaway slaves. Following the Fugitive Slave Act, the Black codes in the late 19th century were used to force many Blacks back into slavery. In contemporary times, the war on drugs had resulted in a sharp disparity rate of the imprisonment of racial minorities. And as a result of the war on drugs, African Americans were up to 10 times more likely than their white counterpart that were arrested on marijuana, and also the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Now, 4 things that I believe that impact racial profiling. 1, we need a clear definition of racial profiling in all its forms. 2, we need to analyze the Supreme Court decisions in the treatment of this practice of racial profiling. 3, we need to explore proposals of reforming to be able to make the transitions and changes that are needed. 4, we need to create additional inventory that moves us closer to eradicating racial profiling. And 5, we need to explore the deep issue of an implicit bias, racial bias, which can be both conscious and unconscious. When an officer, data has very clear showed that when an officer that may be racial biased, when they come up to a car and they see that it is a Black person, the data very clearly shows that there are different responses and reactions as coming up to a car and seeing a white person. And this is one reason why MA severely questioned the psychological testing and held up the contract for a while of the psychiatrist firm that has been doing the testing for police officers. And so there's a cultural piece that needs to be done in terms of the psychological cultural testing of police officers for racial bias and those that are also experienced officers. There are certain characteristics that exist in racial profiling. The conduct of the officer who consciously view Black men as suspicious for no reason other than their race itself. So we look at racial profiling and racial bias by police officer. What the consequences are very severe. Breakdown in trust between the police and the community that's targeted. It represents the targeting of a race, not a individual, but the targeting of a race. In fact, one of the conversations that just took place on benchmark, it takes hypothetically, we can say that some of the data coming out is showing that there are 25 to 30 people that are doing most of the shooting in the North and Northeast community. Well, you got several thousand Black people in the North and Northeast community. Are you going to target a area that is as being just crime ridden because of the population of Black? You see, we're targeting, you target a whole community. And so that is a way of racial stereotyping a whole neighborhood, stereotyping a whole community. Even though the statistical data may show some things, it is the overwhelming majority of our community and African American community, North and Northeast and throughout this city are peace-loving people, people trying to make a living, trying to keep their family in their houses and trying to protect themselves and trying to uplift their living condition, And so when we stereotype a whole community, it reminds me of the dialogue sessions we used to have between the police and community. Dan, I believe it was a good 12, 13 years ago. And one of the officers said that he was trained that to cut his lights off, get in the back, and when he see a possible glimpse of a Black person drive, to put it on his lights and immediately stop them. So there are some officers that come into the Bureau with racial bias and come in with a certain treatment or targeting of a whole neighborhood or a whole community. And so we want to look at, when we talk about those benchmarks for a whole community, there's a lot more to that. The number of peace-loving people and citizens, hardworking citizens of that community are the ones that get the brunt of the mistreatment, and because there may be some shootings that take place, some killings that take place, but you cannot target a whole race of people, a whole neighborhood, a whole community for what's happening, and that has happened previously. Then finally, I want to say, we had a case called Johar Perez case. And Johar Perez was a young man that was driving a Lexus in North Portland. And the officers passed by him driving a Lexus. What came out of we had actually a hearing, a public hearing on, and it's called a public inquiry on that case. Johar Perez, the officer stated that he stopped Johar Perez because he was driving a Lexus. And in that neighborhood, Black folks don't drive a Lexus. And so that encounter led to the shooting of unnecessary shooting of Johar Perez because the officer thought that his cell phone was a gun, and he ended up dead. These kind of confrontations, engagements in our community is not just in terms of stops. Stops lead to other consequences. Yes, officers often say that we need to be able to pretext. Yeah, but pretexting is important in some situations. But if you're pretexting just on the basis of racial bias, race of one group of people, the consequences you're creating more bitterness and more hatred in the community. You're creating more mistrust in the community. You're creating more separation in the community. And so on the one hand, we have to balance those two things out. Our desire to create a peaceful and living and elevated living of a community, and at the same time to practice constitutional policing, a policing that is without racial profiling and racial bias. Thank you very much.
Dr. Haynes, Dan Handelman, history as well as great information that helps guide the work of what PCCEP is doing. And again, the information to show how that this collective data betters to improve the change of this culture that we work so hard. And again, stating how it's to help them and not the people of color, as Dr. Haynes has articulated in our community. Johar Perez, I believe, was the fastest shooting in Portland's history, if I'm not mistaken, as well as the areas of, it turned out to be an Acura, and he was really misled when he saw that car during that time. Dan, you had a moment that you had forgot to add.
If you want Mr. Mozerski to go first, that's fine. Mine's really brief. Do you want me to just do it now?
If it's brief. I want this to be a time for everyone. And again, all three are bringing such valuable information, I believe, to this committee that we want to make sure we have enough time for everyone's expertise here and drawing from it.
Yeah, let's Dan, you can finish that thought and then we'll go straight over to Vadim, I think. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. All right. So the benchmarks that the police use for traffic stops, the accident data at Portland Cop Watch, we sort of conceded that point that people who drive cars are going to be the ones who pulled over in cars. So the benchmark for Black drivers involved in crashes is 15%, but there's still 18 to 20% of the stops. So that doesn't account for that difference. And I would say, I'm not a statistician, but it seems like a statistical significance. Then they have the benchmark for violent crime, which we heard about, which is 18%. And that, it's closer to the 18 to 20% of stops, but that's including the traffic division, whose stops of Black people are much lower than non-traffic officers. And lastly, I mentioned the 44% figure for the focus intervention team. In this year's report, they said they have no benchmark that they can use to explain that number. And I think that's very interesting. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Mr. Vadim.
Thank you very much, Pastor Wisner, and I appreciate you inviting me to come speak here. I feel blessed to be here with Dr. Haynes, who I first met, I believe, when I joined PCCEP years ago. and he was there at the first introductory meeting. Actually, before I joined, we were there at the actual meetings, and my hat's off, if I were a hat today, to Dr. Haynes and all the work that he's done, and likewise to Mr. Handelman, who has joined with the Albino Ministerial Alliance, but also outside of Portland Cop Watch with the Police Accountability Commission. I believe they just concluded their work recently, if I'm not wrong. And so looking forward to see how that evolves. So people who have really, ushered in a new era for Portland in many ways. So I'll focus in on the data piece. The data was mentioned certainly by Mr. Handelman just now. The police came out with their second quarter stops data, which, as Dr. Handelman pointed out, has about 18% stops data for people of Black or African American descent, 17.4% stops, and that includes both the traffic division as well as special units. And that's just drivers, that's not pedestrians, which is a little different. But obviously, that's about 2 to 3 times the Black population in Portland. So how do you dig into that and try to understand what that data actually means? And so the examination of that really dates back to about 1990s. There's a lot of anecdotal data about police traffic and pedestrian stops. But it wasn't until a couple Supreme Court cases in 1993 and 1996 where states actually started taking this information seriously. The U.S. Department of Justice, and I think Jared has already left, but and several other organizations began hosting conferences about how to improve police-community relationships with a focus on collection, analysis, and public reporting of traffic and pedestrian stops. In response, many states mandated the collection of traffic stop data. Here in Oregon in 2017, House Bill 2355 mandated that all Oregon law enforcement agencies submit data regarding officer-initiated traffic and pedestrian stops to the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission. The Oregon Criminal Justice Commission submits a report every year. I believe they just came out with their 4th year of reporting. And so the commission analyzes the data that's submitted from all law enforcement agencies across Oregon. And they use what's called the Oregon Statistical Transparency of Policing Program, STOP. And that's housed within the commission. They provide that information. They provide that program, I believe, to all law enforcement in order to be able to use it. And so the Portland Police Bureau, I believe, has been getting that data since 2001, but based on this 2017 law, it became more standardized. And at that point in time, the city became compliant with other standards for that stop data. Since the passage of House Bill 2355, the STOP program has developed a standardized method for data collection, as well as software, again, that's provided free to all law enforcement agencies. As of December 2022, last year, the STOP program has received at least 2 full years of data from all 148 law enforcement agencies across the state. And that's separated within Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 agencies. Tier 1 is any law enforcement agency that I believe has more than 100 officers, which Portland does. Tier 2 is 25 to that 100, and Tier 3 is 25 or less. So the way that they look at that data is along 3 different areas. And specifically, I'm talking about racial ethnic disparities when it comes to that data, to kind of look at, the fact that 17.4% of Black or African American individuals in Portland are stopped by police. And so the first thing they look at is what's called decision to stop analysis. That analysis takes advantage of variations in daylight and darkness throughout the year, and it's based on really the assumption that it's easier for an officer to discern the race, ethnicity of an individual during the day when it's light versus at night when it's dark. And so the analysis compares the stop data for minority individuals to those for white individuals during certain time windows surrounding sunrise and sunsets. And it's a very specific time window. So sometimes it's, sunrise and sunsets, especially here in the Northwest, changes pretty dramatically, but it looks at specific time windows. So you get the same sort of drivers, and it helps with variability throughout time, but also compares when these stops are made during hours that are nighttime and when those stops are made during those hours that become daytime around that sunrise, sunset. If it's demonstrated by these statistics from decision to stop analyses that minority individuals are more likely to be stopped in daylight, which is when an officer would presumably be able to distinguish an individual's skin color, race, ethnicity, and so forth, then there would be evidence of a disparity. The second analytical method from the STOP program is called the STOP Outcomes Analysis, which examines match groups using a statistical technique called propensity score analysis, which honestly, I don't know what that means, but it looks to disparities in outcomes. So once an individual is stopped, do they get a citation? Do their vehicles get searched, or do they get searched? Does it lead to an arrest? If looking at all these data points that the CJC looks at, time of day, time of week, when the stop is made, reason for the stop, gender, age, if taking all these things into consideration, if minority individuals are cited, searched, arrested more than similarly situated white individuals, then there would be, again, evidence of disparity. The third thing that the CJC looks at is what's called the search finding analysis. And that's the relative success for the searches. And by success, it means, is there a seizure of some sort of contraband? So if they do search a car, search a person, does that search actually lead to something? And again, if there's a disparity, which is if the searches for white individuals result in fewer positive, successful outcomes than for Black and vice versa. I'm sorry. If searches for white individuals have a greater success rate than Black, Latino, Asian individuals, then that would be an indication that there's some other thing going on for the search, such as racism or implicit bias and so forth. So let me kind of delve into those numbers a little bit here, because the CJC came out with its fourth report. This is the first time where it's had a couple years to look over all the data for all 148 agencies. And so I'll begin with this decision to stop analysis. And this is they say it's the gold standard for whether initial law enforcement decisions to stop an individual are racially motivated or not. So once again, it takes a look at certain periods of time, whether it's 5 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the evening. And given these data points, they should capture similar driving populations. Comparisons made between the race ethnicity of stopped drivers in light and darkness will detect whether stops are being made in disparate fashions when race ethnicity is visible. And so the CJC in their last report and in their previous reports that I actually looked at when as a member of PCCEP and the policy committee that is here today, for the full tier 1, tier 2 models, all comparisons show no statistical significant difference in the odds of minorities stopped in daylight compared to darkness. But the analysis does not end there, and I think this is where it's important. Next, we go to the stop outcome analysis. And this report presents the results from 2 analyses assessing outcomes occurring after the stop, as I mentioned. And the first of these approaches is a stop outcome analysis. And the second one is a search finding analysis. What happens after the stop is made? And so as with a decision stop analysis, the analysis conducted under this section happened for 2 years in all agencies. And I'll just generally talk about all agencies and then specifically about Portland. There were significant disparities that were found for search or arrest outcomes, in addition to citation for 6 agencies. So Beaverton Police Department, Jefferson County, Marion County, Oregon State Police, Salem, and Washington counties. Disparities were reported for either search and or arrests of Latino individuals, Latinx individuals, and sometimes also for citations, so not just arrests. Oregon State Police and Pendleton Police Department showed disparities in searches and arrests for Native American individuals. And PPB showed disparities in searches of Black individuals. So what they found was once an individual was stopped, and from the daylight versus evening, the CJC found that there was not a disparity that was statistically important to them, at least. And of course, this committee can review all that. But what they did found was Black individuals were searched more often than their white counterparts. And that, again, has been a theme, I think, for quite some time in these findings in the previous reports as well. The second area post stopping an individual for driving or walking is a search finding analysis. And that's whether the likelihood of a search was successful and whether it differed across racial ethnic groups. So if officers are subjecting a group to more frequent searches based on racial or ethnic bias, then what's called their hit rate for that group will decrease. If a minority group's hit rate is less than a white hit rate, this indicates the minority group is over-searched, which is evidence of disparity. And so put simply, if search decisions are based on race, ethnic, neutral factors, then the hit rate across all racial ethnic groups should be similar. And if they are substantially dissimilar, then a disparity is identified. The CJC found that no agency was identified as having a statistically significant disparity for the search finding analysis. And so according to the CJC, no agency was identified as having a statistically significant disparity in 2 or more tests performed on the stop data. Therefore, no agency is referred to receive technical help from DPSST. And that's, if you meet 2 of those criteria, then that law enforcement agency is referred to further training and evaluation. There were no agencies that were found to be disparate in 2 of those. However, this does not mean that the results for any agency should be ignored or are not close to threshold of identification. So there's some things that are close, but not enough of a statistical difference for the CJC to say this is evidence of racial bias or implicit bias.
I sent the 3-minute check for you there, Vadim, in the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would suggest wrapping up on the current thought, and then we do have this reserved for open public comment. But I should say we would love to have any or all of you back for our ongoing discussions for this topic for sure.
Oh, thank you so much. I apologize for going overboard. And importantly, in March 2022, the state legislature passed SB 151019, which includes several public safety law changes, including officers having to tell people before a search that they have the right to not have their vehicle searched. And since then, we've seen a pretty dramatic decrease, as one would probably expect, in the search rate for vehicles. And so the hope is that we continue to see that rate of decrease because of that state law. So if that helps at all as to where to focus, of course, I'd be happy to talk some more, answer questions, or come back at any point in time. Thank you.
As this being a great topic, as you see, there's so much information and our heads can get swarmed with so much, even where that we have done this guiding work with the history of what we've heard with Dr. Haynes, the recording documents of what Dr. I call him Doctor, but the champion Dan Handelman in information. And again, my newfound friend, Mr. Vadim, who I found to be very knowledgeable in our conversations, which is where my head is always spinning as me and Dory was talking about this. But I do want to turn this part over to our community as well as Dory to help our staff to help guide any questions and any follow-ups from that point. Let me ask really, really quick, is there a wrap-up comment from Dr. Haynes, Dr. Handelman, as well as Dr. Vadim? Any wrap-up thoughts? There's a silence. It sounds like when we say in church, everybody said amen, and the benediction is now given to you, Dory.
Yeah, I see Dan does have a hand up.
Okay,
and while Dan's speaking, community, so we are and PCCEP members, this is now our open public comment time. So please put your hands up if there's anything you'd like to comment on, questions you'd like to raise in the remaining time in this meeting. So go ahead, Dan.
Thank you. I just wanted to reiterate some things I've said to the PCCEP before, but first of all, when you look at the data, you'll see that the rate of people who refuse to consent to a search is much higher for white people because they feel less likely that the police officer is going to take it out on them for asserting their rights than it is for black people. What I mentioned before about the disparity between the traffic division and the non-traffic division, only 11% of the stops by traffic division are black drivers, whereas 21% for the non-traffic. And pedestrian stops, which are also in these data, they took a nosedive after the state defined what a stop is. And even though Portland can define it more broadly, they have refused to. So we went from having several hundred pedestrian stops a year to having just a couple of dozen, which I find very hard to believe. I mean, they're going very narrowly by the state's definition of what a pedestrian stop is, and I think we're losing a lot of information because of that decision. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I think that was the question I was looking for earlier that I was wanting to not get lost in, Dory.
Byron, I see your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Dan, why is that on his question that he just mentioned? And I would hurry up with things. I would say that's history. You know, that's history of the police being on black people, the history that the police department is mainly for black people. So all this that you're talking about, Dan Handelman, and what you just spoke of, that's from history. This is what we deal with. Again, I've said this before. If it's not directed towards you, how would you know? You know, it's really hard for Caucasian people to try. I sit up here and listen to them speak of these things and what is needed, and yet they don't necessarily are directed this constant thing for over years and years of being directed towards us. So understand that this is more than just data. This is more than just what we need to do and how we're going to make things different. Thank you, Dory.
Thanks, Byron. Do we have any more public comment from either PCCEP members or anyone in attendance?
There is one in the chat comment.
Yes. Nathan, did you want to read that out so it's a part of the record for the meeting or the video?
Oh, sure. Yeah, something I think I talked about this a little bit last year, and I actually included this in my statement to the court at the recent hearing. I think PCCEP should consider advocating for abolishing abolishing consent searches for a couple of reasons. You know, a big one for me, I think, and it came up during this conversation, is that, you know, there's the disparity, I think, in, you know, the perception of whether it's safe to deny consent to a search. There is a, you know, it's a great reform that we're requiring people to be informed of their rights. But, you know, my understanding, just from talking to people, is that, and reading up about it, is that it's almost never in your interest to consent to a search. And so it's just like fundamentally a little weird that you're asking someone to do something that they shouldn't do. And if they understood the form, they wouldn't do. It's like, you know, sign this form to, get slapped in the face. Like you just shouldn't do it. It's a weird thing to do. And, it's a good reform and it's still better than what we had before. But we shouldn't be doing it. That's just my opinion. I realize that's a little bit radical. And then the other thing, I think, a lot of folks in the community sort of expected that with this reform, we would, see consent searches essentially eliminated, because why consent to a search? It usually isn't in your interest to do that. And I even, recently saw a TV report. Someone did a ride along. Sorry, I'm going long, but I'll wrap this up. Someone did a ride along, reported a ride along. Officer stopped someone. Dude had a gun and drugs in his bag. He consented to a search anyways. I don't know, why you would consent to that. It's, you shouldn't do that, is my understanding. I'm not a lawyer. Maybe a lawyer can chime in. And so clearly that was a failure of the system. In some ways a success because you potentially got those guns and drugs off the street. On the other hand, it raises questions. So I'll yield the time.
Thanks for raising that, Nathan.
Definitely had a comment in the areas of where that, again, a lot of that points back to the very reason of stop from state statute and that case with Bain and Vane, where I know at that point, Bishop Wells was a witness in the Ninth Circuit about when an African American is knowing he is detained or being held to be able to say whether yes or no to this consent. But that is an argument that is on that level, I believe. Stephanie, would you like to address more of your point there?
I can, but I don't want to take time away from anyone else. I'm happy to flesh that out later, too.
I think given the maybe complexity here, I agree this would be an interesting discussion for PCCEP to raise later on and maybe unpack further. So let's definitely take note of that. I think we're kind of running up to the edge of our time here, and I do want to make sure we're getting any last community comments, PCCEP comments, if there are any. Anything more for open public comment this evening? All right. So again, I think the idea here, preliminary meeting, great discussion tonight. Thank you so much to Dr. Haynes, Vadim Mazursky, and Dan Handelman for your contributions and bringing in different perspectives and your expertise in such different parts of how this process works and has worked, and really enriched our conversation tonight. And PCCEP, I think we will be figuring out how to move forward and how you want to engage with this in the next month or so. What's next? So we have a community engagement subcommittee meeting next week. And as mentioned at the top of the meeting, we will be moving forward with appointments of 5 new PCCEP members very soon. And you will also be getting some information about events surrounding those appointments. Yeah, so I think that wraps us up for the evening, right on time. And I think we'll just end it with thank you. So thank you everyone for your contributions this evening once again. And with that, the time is 8:01 p.m. and this meeting is adjourned.
Recording stopped.
I got through it. Thank you,
Sorry,
Dory.
you got through it.